is an unrehearsed program. The views expressed are those of the guests and not necessarily those of the producer. Today's topic:
The Terror in Bombay in Passion for Truth, award-winning program.
Welcome to another edition of Passion for Truth. India arrested several suspected accused in connection with a bomb blast case in Bombay that killed more than 180 men. According to several news sources, their links appear to come from Nepal, Bangladesh, but they could be connected to Pakistan. Pakistan denies any connection with the bombings. Are the government's charges baseless, or is Pakistan getting off the hook? And most importantly, if we help our ally Israel, should we turn away from another ally, India, that gets attacked periodically by various terrorists, starting with Roger Savarano from the Beckett Fund for Religious Liberty, Tim Fiss, news commentator and a legal analyst, Meena Bhagat, staff attorney from the Jubilee Campaign International, Fred Peterson, counterterrorism advisor. Welcome you all. Starting with you, Tim, are the Indian government charges baseless, or is Pakistan playing a blame-free game?
Who can tell? What we do know is that the people who carried out this particular attack have connections to Bangladesh and to Nepal, and we do know that the Indian government blames Pakistan for everything. If it rains too much, it's Pakistan's fault. If it doesn't rain enough, it's Pakistan's fault. That or they blame their own internal minorities, which they say are just operatives of ISI anyway. So at this point, I'm just inclined to say, so far we don't have any evidence to say that the Pakistanis are behind it. If the evidence emerges, we'll look at it then.
Meena, India and the U.S. are allies on war against terrorism. Should the U.S. intervene just as it did in Israel?
I don't agree with the United States taking on such a huge responsibility as trying to intervene in every single problem around the world. Certainly we live in a much smaller world now after 2000 and the attacks in 2001. So yes, there is a responsibility to communicate with each other. There is a responsibility to have transparency with each other, but I think each government should be responsible for stabilizing its own country and providing security for its own country.
Fred, the problem is that in this crisis, India has never been able to produce evidence of Pakistan's involvement, in the acts of terrorism particularly. In fact, it made a fool of itself during President Clinton's visit in 2000 when 35 Sikhs were killed in Kashmir. And they said it was the Pakistani militants who did it, and later it turned out that they were innocent civilians and the government even killed them. And now we find out that it was a state-sponsored terrorism, and nobody had anything to do with it. Is it the lack of evidence that makes these crises go unresolved?
As Dr. Ferris has said, and I would like to reiterate, India has a tendency to look to Pakistan for all bad weather, humidity, and all events. However, that being said, there is a reason for that, and that is because there has been and is an ongoing enmity, religious-based, that exists and has existed between the two countries. And that has created a vital threat to the Indian state. What I think we can draw from this incident, as much as anything else, is a realization that we are at war with an international, not necessarily state-led, but free agent, suprastate terrorist network that is something that mankind has not yet had to deal with. We see this from Canada, where a group of terrorists just in the nick of time were apprehended prior to executing a plot to behead the Prime Minister and as many members of Parliament as they could on television, to bombings in Britain, bombings in Spain, bombings throughout Europe, the World Trade Center, of course, and in India. No state No state is immune from this, and in fact, this warfare is internecine within the Islamic states itself, where Shia are bombing Sunni, are bombing Shia, and it is very difficult, but it is time for civilized peoples to come together to decide that they will stand together and cooperate with one another in an attempt to defeat this worldwide.
Roger, is there, what do you make of the religious animosity existing between the two countries? I mean, this doesn't mean that India has not produced any concrete evidence. Pakistani militants have created trouble for India on many, many occasions.
Sure.
But how the lack of concrete evidence, the crises get blown out of proportion, or the crises are misplaced elsewhere. What do you make of that?
Well, there's been a long history of tensions between the Muslim community and the Hindu community in India, especially in the north, where we have contested areas. And it's sometimes difficult to distinguish between the political conflict and the religious. But as you mentioned earlier, the global terrorism has a very large, unfortunate extremist component that is often tied to religion and abuse of religion. And what we see is a fundamental misunderstanding of the human person. We'll see religious extremists who believe that their view is true, which is fine to believe, but it's so true that it must be forced onto others. And that's where they cross the line. When they use violence as a means to push their religion, then they are violating all fundamental tenets of human rights. And that may be some of the background behind what was happening in India recently with the bombing.
On the other hand, do we advance our war on terror by blaming the Islamic world or whomever for everything, whether we have evidence or not, and do we not let others off the hook when you have a country where the newspaper Hitavada said they paid the governor of Punjab, the late governor of Punjab, $1.5 billion to foment terrorism. You have this case where 2 independent investigations found that it was the government. You have the Air India case. Time after time after time, there have been cases of activities being attributed to the Pakistanis or Kashmiri militants or Sikh militants or this militant or that militant or some other militant, and turning out that India's been involved itself. One of the police said they pre-planned the Gujarat massacre. Time after time after time, we've seen this happen.
Okay, now is it, speaking of Air India bombing case, and I don't know how many of you are familiar, is it because India jumps to the conclusion very quickly? I mean, if it takes longer time to solve a crime case, India does not have to pronounce the suspected militants who were involved in the case. In the Air India bombing case, they immediately pointed a finger at some people, and the case went on for more than 20 years, and it turned out that they had nothing to do with the Air India bombing. Is it that India has to weigh the evidence and then pronounce the arrested people, or then pronounce the alleged crime cases, and India will get a better credibility, you think, Meena?
I certainly would agree with that. You have to take your time, but the problem is when you have such emotional or news-breaking cases, the public wants answers, and they demand that from the government because they feel unsafe. So there's a quick tunnel vision approach to trying to find the correct perpetrator without seeing like a broader spectrum of investigation take place. And that's the problem, because the Indian government is under a lot of pressure to come up with a culprit, but at the same sense they have to be responsible in their investigation tactics, and certainly abide by their own laws and abide by international laws when they're trying to bring to justice whoever perpetrated such a horrific crime. So certainly they should take their time, and definitely they should be taking educated investigative tactics, but at the same time, I don't think 20 years is considered reasonable to come up with a final conclusion to what happened and to serve justice properly.
If Al-Qaeda is planning to carry